Hi, everybody, and welcome to week 5 of Social and Economic Justice 2. This week, we are going to be focusing in on community practice skills. And our objectives are this week to examine the skills necessary for effective community work associated with community organizing and interpersonal relations. And our objectives really are for you to be able to develop and apply your micro-practiced social work skills that are also necessary for community practice. To also develop and apply group social work skills necessary for community practice, and then to also begin to look at the importance of leadership in community practice. And I think you've heard me make the analogy or the parallel a couple of times this semester between micro-level practice and macro-level practice. And I think in this week you're going to see how you can use some of your micro-level social work skills in efforts related to community practice. So the goals of community work can be varied. Therefore, the skill set and the framework that you need to be able to effectively do community work really relies first and foremost on generalist practice skills. At various times, depending the setting you're working within or the community you're working within, you're likely to be working on individual change, organizational change, community change, political or governmental change, or cultural change. And a lot of times you're actually really working at the intersections of some of these. So you're really, I think one of the most important things in terms of skills for community work from my perspective is the ability to communicate with stakeholders at these multiple levels, from the individual client or community member to being able to communicate within organizational settings, to be able to communicate in ways that advance community change, to be able to communicate in the language of government and bureaucracy and policy, and then also to understand cultural aspects of the community and how you're trying to affect change in those areas. So it really is a generalist skill set that's needed in community work, which is a little bit different from if you're working in the clinical realm. So some of the roles of the community organizer. As you saw a little bit last week, there are a number of different roles for the community worker. You could find yourself serving as a teacher, a catalyst for change, where you're trying to affect some sort of change. You could be working as a facilitator. You could be working as a broker, trying to sort of connect organizations or agencies to be able to deliver a service. You could be an advocate. You could be serving as a researcher or a counselor, and a number of other roles, and sometimes more than one. One of my first experiences with community organizing was many years ago when I was the service coordinator in a subsidized senior apartment building that had 70 units for lower income older adults. And the building was a brand new building. It had just opened, so it was sort of a newly formed community because everybody had just moved in. And one of my roles as the service coordinator there was to facilitate the creation of a resident council. So that involved engaging the residents, facilitating them sort of coming together and defining what their resident council was going to look like and what their role was going to be. And in my role as sort of a facilitator, I was part teacher, part facilitator. I was first, introducing the concept of the resident council to them and talking about what that could potentially be. But ultimately, I was really facilitating their coming together and coming to a consensus to determine what they wanted their resident council to look like. So it wasn't me imposing this council on them. It was me helping them to understand what the benefits of a residence council potentially could be, and then facilitating their dialogue with each other to be able to create that council and use it effectively. And that's just one of many, many examples I could provide of a community organization role. So framing the necessary skills. Community practice, as I said, requires a number of skills domains to work with such a variety of roles. So these skill domains include a number of areas. such as interpersonal relationships, group skills, right? And that sounds a lot like what we do in one-on-one social work. So for many of you, those are probably things that you're more familiar with. Organizing, administration, that could be things, like program management, supervision, planning and program development. I've done more recently, really over the last 10 years of my professional career, much of my experience has been around planning and program development. Organizational assessment activities and research and evaluation really is primarily what I do in my role as a director of grant research and development for a nonprofit organization. And then finally, policy development. So again, there's a range of skills that you need here. And that's not to say that if you're doing community work that practice that you alone are going to be doing all of these things, but these are a list of potential skills that are important in community practice. And I can tell you, a lot of my experience with community practice and organizing, I learned a lot of these by doing. Combination of what you learn in your MSW program, but also by actually being engaged in these processes. Earlier in my career, more as not necessarily in a lead role, but then later taking more leadership roles in these types of activities. So framing the necessary skills. These next couple of slides are going to examine a few selective but critical components from those domains, right? Because that was a pretty long list, so we're going to hone in on what's critical. And again, these are just a few of the important critical components. It's definitely not all of them. So first and foremost, right, interpersonal skills. Regardless of what kind of practice we're engaging in, I think as social workers, this is always going to be at the top of the list. So when you're working in clinical social work or micro level social work, right, your client is your client. But when you're working in community practice, the client is the community. However, communities are made up of individuals, right? So this idea of building relationships is absolutely essential. So you're still using those same one-on-one social work skills that you're using when you are working individually with somebody. However, the overall community is your client, and you're engaging with the individuals within it. And a key component, right, we all know as social workers, a key component of any relationship building is trust. So a lot of times the community worker, for example, the scenario I mentioned when I was working in the senior apartment building, the community worker is often not a part of the community, right? I wasn't a part of that community. I did not live there. I worked there. So the community worker is often not a part of the community, has a different educational and socioeconomic history, and may be racially, ethnically different. And all of those factors, again, to follow through with my example, were very true in the senior apartment building that I worked in. I was working in a low income subsidized senior apartment building. I grew up in suburban area of Philadelphia. I am Caucasian. About 95% of the residents in the building that I was working in were African American. So there were a number of differences in terms of me as the community worker and the community I was working within. So in these scenarios, in order to build trust and build relationships, we need a number of skills. So these include, and I think some of these are not new to any of you, are first and foremost cultural sensitivity, knowing and acting in accordance with the world frame of our clients. We all see the world through lenses, right? And we have assumptions about how the world works. And norms, beliefs, behaviors are strongly affected by these lenses. And these lenses are created for us or with us by the groups of which we are a part. And one of the things that we know as social workers is critical is that even though our lens may be different, being able to hear and be respectful of the lenses that our clients or our community that we are working with, in the case of community organizing, to be able to have an understanding of that lens. Trust is difficult to develop without taking the lenses of our clients seriously. So taking the time to learn and understand the lens is critical. So reading, observation, asking questions respectfully are useful ways to learn about your clients and the people in the community you're working within. Another example of that, in the senior apartment building, we had 70 units and there were 4 floors in the building. So the approach I took to initially developing relationships with people and with the end goal of establishing this resident council was I first met with people individually, just to get to know everybody in the building, but I then held a initial just sort of get-together meeting on each of the 4 floors. So I invited, each floor had a community room, so I invited, the first floor to come to the community room on whatever day it was, and we had, and just to begin to talk to one another and get to know one another. So I did that on each floor, and that was one of the ways that I was able in the beginning to begin to establish trust, to let people know who I was, and what my role was, to hear what some of their concerns were, with everybody being new to having just moved into the building, and that really did work well, because certain floors had certain issues that related specifically to situations that were occurring on their floor. So it was a good way to begin to address begin to establish trust. All right. I'm going to run out of time here. So secondly, critical, and I think this goes without saying as well, is respect, right? Treating clients as equals and partners, especially in community organizing. The last thing you want to do is to sort of come in with this whole theory and framework and impose it on the community that you are trying to work within. Clients and members of the community should be equals and partners in the community organizing and community practice process. And we know that nothing destroys relationships quicker than disrespect. And really, when it comes down to it, respect is simply fair treatment. And it's also affected by treating people in accord with their cultural norms, or at least not belittling other people's cultural norms if they are different than yours. And a number of really simple actions can show respect. So things like sharing, right? Whether it's food, we always say where I work that if you want to get people to a meeting or an event, food, sharing of anything. It could be sharing of information, asking for permission, joining local ongoing community activities, contribute to but don't dominate discussions, right? Nothing can, I think, impact respect as somebody who dominates a conversation and doesn't listen to other people who are speaking and give other people a chance to speak. Answer questions fairly and quickly. Don't interrupt a person speaking, and accept compliments and credit for accomplishments. Another thing that I would add to this list, in terms of simple actions that can show respect, are signs that that whatever event you're holding or meeting you're having is a place where everyone is welcome, particularly communities that have been historically marginalized. So sometimes something as simple as a rainbow flag to acknowledge that it is a welcoming space for LGBTQ individuals, or there have been a number of signs that I've seen in my community interactions more recently that have, in response to the recent election, that have demonstrated that people of various cultural backgrounds and ethnic backgrounds are welcome. So I think sometimes, not that a sign is going to change the world, but I think that sometimes having these symbols that whatever space you're in is a welcoming space can go a long way to establishing respect with communities. Honesty, open communication, and transparency is important. A lack of honesty is disrespectful and can create mistrust, right? So it undermines those first couple of critical values we talked about. One way to build honesty into a relationship is through open communication and transparency. And transparency means making decisions in the light of day, right? Not making decisions behind closed doors. And it's unlikely that all decisions may be made prior to a decision, but you want to try to set up rules in advance so that people don't feel blindsided. Group skills. In the community, you're going to often be working with groups. So group skills are also incredibly important, includes particularly when we're talking about decision-making processes. So how groups make decisions affect perceptions of trust, respect, and transparency. And there's a number of different systems for making decisions. They can be very formal, sort of how we see things happen in our state and federal legislatures, which use parliamentary procedure. but all forms have their place, but two in particular we want to focus on are consensus and democracy.